What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we will be breaking down our must-start quarterbacks and tight ends for Week 16 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. Keep in mind, going through today's video, we're not including absolute studs like Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes. We're looking at lower tier quarterbacks and tight ends. So no guys like Travis Kelce in this video who you might be considering benching or you might be considering over other players. And we are looking at matchups and overall performance so far on the season to ultimately include these players on the must start list. I'll also be going through a good amount of streaming options at the quarterback position for those of you guys who do own Jalen Hurts. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, going into last week, towards the beginning of the week, I kind of struggled with what to do with Justin Fields. We knew it was a tough matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles. We had Fields coming off of the bye week, but as the week began to go on, I really encourage you guys to have confidence in starting Justin Fields, and it really paid off. 23.5 fantasy points against the Eagles, 152 yards through the air, 2 touchdowns and 95 yards on the ground. Listen, guys, Fields comes in as your quarterback 5 on the season so far. He gets the Buffalo Bills this weekend, a team that is in the top 5 in terms of points scored against the quarterback position. They have played very well against opposing quarterbacks, but once again, here in Week 16, I have confidence in Justin Fields. He is a must-start quarterback to finish out the 2022 fantasy football season. He gets the Detroit Lions in Week 17, a gorgeous matchup. The Lions, one of the worst teams against opposing quarterbacks from a fantasy perspective. And if you play through Week 18, he gets the Minnesota Vikings, another very good matchup for Justin Fields. So overall, I love Fields the rest of the season. I don't care about this matchup with the Buffalo Bills. He brings way too much upside to the table. He's way too talented of a player to consider benching unless you have an absolute stud quarterback in front of him. You have to start Justin Fields for the remainder of the fantasy season and here in Week 16. All right, Geno Smith comes in as your quarterback 7 overall on the season. He struggled last week against one of the best defensive units in the NFL, in the San Francisco 49ers. 15.3 fantasy points, 238 passing yards, and a touchdown, as well as 18 total rushing yards. It was a rough week for Geno, but when we look on the season so far since Week 8, Geno has given you 19 or more fantasy points in every matchup except for that matchup against the San Francisco 49ers. So overall, Geno has had a really good season. Like I said, your quarterback 7 so far on the year. He gets the Kansas City Chiefs this weekend, a team that is allowing the 4th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. So I like Geno. If you're a Geno Smith owner, I would have confidence going into the week. This is a good game script for the Seahawks as well. Both of these teams, being the Chiefs and the Seahawks, need to win this football game in terms of their overall playoff seeding at the moment. And this is a more important game, obviously, for the Seahawks as they are kind of on the bubble and in the wild card picture at the moment. So this should be a good competitive game script, and ultimately it's a good matchup from a fantasy perspective for Geno Smith, so I like him quite a bit going into Week 16. All right, next up on the list, I've got Derek Carr coming in as your quarterback 14 so far on the year. Keep in mind, if you do own Jalen Hurts and you're worried about this weekend, Derek Carr is rostered in 51% of fantasy leagues according to the Sleeper app, and I think he's a really good option for the week. But overall, if you're a Derek Carr owner, I would have some confidence in Carr going in to the weekend. He's coming off of a very good performance with 20.2 fantasy points against the New England Patriots in Week 15, 231 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and an interception. And this weekend, he gets a defensive unit that is far worse than the New England Patriots and the Pittsburgh Steelers, a team that is allowing the 11th most fantasy points to the quarterback position so far on the year. A team that essentially has no secondary. I expect a big game for Devontae Adams in this game. Mac Hollins has been playing well as of late. We know the run game is very good for the Raiders, and Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller should both be back for the Raiders in this game as well. This is a good game script once again for actually both of these teams involved. Both the Raiders and the Steelers need to win out, but they have playoff hopes alive, so this should be a good competitive game. When we look since week 9 for Derek Carr, he's given you 17 or more fantasy points in every matchup except for that abysmal matchup against the Rams just 2 weeks ago with 4.5 fantasy points. But overall, for most of his matchups as of late, he has been pretty solid. For majority of you guys, this is one of the last weeks you can start Derek Carr because he gets the Niners next week. The majority of you guys don't play through week 18, but he does have a good matchup against the Chiefs. So I would take advantage of this matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers here in week 16. I think Carr is a very solid option at the quarterback position. All right, very quickly here, I want to go over some streaming options because I know this week is looking very worrisome if you are a Jalen Hurts owner. We literally could not have the shoulder injury to Jalen Hurts happen at a worse time. But let's take a look at some options that might be available for you. Daniel Jones coming off of a very bad fantasy performance with 9.9 fantasy points against the Washington Commanders. He sits at 44% roster. When we look at his overall season, he's been kind of hard to trust, but has still had a good season since week 10. He's given you 17 or more fantasy points in every matchup except for week 12 against the Cowboys and last week against the Washington Commanders. But he gets the Minnesota Vikings this week, and the team that is allowing the 5th most fantasy points to the quarterback position overall. Like I said, Jones sits at 44% rostered. He's definitely an option for you guys. Moving right along, we got Jared Goff sitting at 52% rostered, a little bit higher. Since week 12, he's given you 17 or more fantasy points in every matchup except for this past week against the New York Jets, where he had 14 fantasy points, 252 passing yards, and a touchdown. He gets the Carolina Panthers, kind of a middle of the pack unit against the quarterback position, but with how much the Lions have been throwing the football as of late, and the fact that both the Lions and the Panthers have playoff hopes alive, this should be a pretty good overall game where I could see both defenses letting up. I like Jared Goff going into this week if you're desperate for a streaming option. Next up, we got Aaron Rodgers coming in as your quarterback, 17 so far on the year. He gets a very good matchup against the Miami Dolphins in Miami, so we don't need to worry about another cold weather game. But the Dolphins are allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to the quarterback position. You know, Rodgers was starting to look like a quarterback who we could potentially trust when we look at weeks 10 and 11, where he at least had 19 or more fantasy points. But over the last 3 weeks, 13.6 or less fantasy points for Rodgers. This is a stream based on matchup, purely based off of the matchup against the Miami Dolphins. I really want to emphasize that. But if you are desperate enough, Aaron Rodgers still sits at 57% roster, but I know he's been dropped in a lot of leagues out there, so he could be an option for you. Tom Brady comes in as your quarterback, 15 so far on the year. He gets the Arizona Cardinals, a unit allowing the 8th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. When we look at Brady overall from a fantasy perspective, since week 8, he's given you 17 or more fantasy points in all his matchups except for week 9 and week 14. So he's coming off of an 18.5 fantasy performance. Would have been a better performance if he didn't have the 4 turnovers, but ultimately still 312 passing yards and 3 touchdowns for Brady, and he gets a good matchup against the Cardinals and a must-win game for the Buccaneers if they want to stay atop of their respective division. So I think that, you know, Brady is a quarterback here at the end of the season who gets the Cardinals and the Panthers, and if you play through week 18, the Atlanta Falcons, who ultimately we can trust because this Buccaneers unit needs to win out with the way things are looking in the NFC South. So I do like Tom Brady going into the week and probably for the rest of the year as well. Moving right along, I got Brock Purdy going up against the Washington Commanders, a unit that is kind of in the middle of the pack against the quarterback position, but we know the secondary has been faulty at times. Purdy in his first 3 starts in the NFL, 15 or more fantasy points, 21 fantasy points against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers was his ceiling. So Purdy definitely an option. He's still just 12% roster, definitely a player you can take a look at. The last 2 players I want to talk about are Zach Wilson and Sam Darnold. Zach Wilson gets the Jacksonville Jaguars, a really good matchup. It is a short week for Wilson. Thursday Night Football, not, you know, something that I'm really in love with from a fantasy perspective, but the Jaguars have allowed the 6th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. 20.3 points for Zach Wilson last week. Kind of shocked a lot of people against the Detroit Lions in week 15. 317 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. exception. I actually think that Zach Wilson, if you're desperate enough, he sits at 15% rostered, is a player we can consider. And last but not least, I've got Sam Darnold. If you're absolutely desperate, he's rostered in 8% of fantasy leagues. Hasn't really looked great in his return, as the starter for the Panthers, but ultimately the Lions are allowing the most fantasy points to the quarterback position. I think that Sam Darnold, if you're absolutely desperate, is a quarterback we can consider moving into week 16. All right, moving on to the tight end position. I'm going to start with Evan Engram, who gets the Jets, a unit that is allowing the 16th most fantasy points to the tight end position. Now, of course, this is a Thursday night football game, which is, for me, a game script that I usually try to steer away from. But ultimately, Engram has moved up to your tight end 4 so far on the season with his combined efforts in the last 3 weeks. 14 points in week 13, 39 points in week 14, and 14.2 points in week 15. Good enough matchup here against the Jets. It should be a good game script for the Jaguars and the Jets, as both these teams need to win this game to keep their playoff hopes as alive as possible. Engram and Trevor Lawrence, who's been absolutely humming as of late, have really established a nice chemistry here at the end of the season. They look good, kind of towards the beginning, the middle part of the season, but there's just been some bleak, lapses in Engram's overall production throughout the year. We're really hoping that this production can just finish out the year as he gets the Jets and the Texans next week. And then for those of you who play through week 18, a good matchup against the Tennessee Titans to finish out the year. So ultimately a good game script here, something we're really looking for in a lot of these matchups at this point in the season. A good enough matchup from a fantasy perspective overall. And when we just look at what Engram, Trevor Lawrence, and the Jaguars, when we look at what they've been doing as of late, it's really hard to not ride that momentum. I think Engram a really solid start moving into week 16. All right, next up I've got Chig Okonkwo, who gets the Houston Texans, a unit that's allowing the 10th most fantasy points to the tight end position. Chig led the Titans in receptions in week 15. The week before, he led the team in receiving yards for the Titans. Overall, he's just looked good these last couple of weeks. One of the most talked about tight ends in all fantasy football for the last couple of weeks, kind of bringing on some hope to the tight end position that's been an absolute wasteland here at the end of the season. The last 3 weeks for Chig, 10 or more fantasy points and a ceiling of 18.5 fantasy points in week 14. A good matchup here for the Tennessee Titans. The Texans have looked kind of good as of late, kind of surprised us against two really good teams, arguably two of the best teams in the NFL, against the Chiefs last week and the Cowboys the previous week. The Titans need to win this game with how good the Jaguars have looked as of late and starting to threaten to take that spot for the number 1 seed in terms of the AFC South for the playoffs. This is a must-win game for the Tennessee Titans. The Texans are going to do whatever they can to win this game and gain some momentum here at the end of the season and potentially keep a division rival out of the playoffs. So a good game script here overall, a good matchup from a fantasy perspective, and the production for Chig has been really good the last couple of weeks. He's definitely a tight end I want in my starting lineup moving into week 16. All right, last but not least, more of a streaming option, but a streaming option I really like is Cade Otton, sitting at 12% rostered the time I'm recording this. So definitely a tight end he can go out and target if you're struggling at the position. He gets the Arizona Cardinals, a unit that's allowing the most fantasy points to the tight end position overall. I know the last 2 weeks haven't looked very good for Cade Otton, who's had some really good moments since week 5 of the season, a couple double-digit fantasy performances and some, ultimately disappointing performances as well. But we talked about this with Tom Brady earlier. This is a must-win game for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It's a good game script, like I've said throughout the whole video, something we're really looking for here at the end of the fantasy season. And overall, it's a great matchup. I mean, literally, you cannot get a better matchup at the tight end position. I think that Cade Otton, although the last 2 weeks haven't looked so good with just 6 combined targets, I think that this is a week where he could absolutely show up a really solid streaming option as we move into week 16. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel, and please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. We have must starts out at every other position, including defense and kicker so far on the week. So make sure to take a look at the other videos for the week, and please let us know whatever we can do to help you guys get to the fantasy championship. We are here to do to help you. Look out for our next fantasy Q&A live stream. We would love to have you there. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching, and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.